So welcome again, everyone, to our SCMLi learning series that is focused on spiritual capital. This is our third in a series of 9 so far that we have scheduled that will go on for the next couple of months. We have the distinct pleasure of having Professor David Palmer join us today and give a presentation. A brief introduction for Professor Palmer. He is located in Hong Kong. He is a member of the Hong Kong Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences. And we are very pleased to have him present today on spiritual capital from a Taoist, Confucianism, and Buddhism perspective. And the talk is called Spiritual Capital in Taoism, Confucianism, Buddhism, a sociological perspective on capacity building. So with that, without further ado, I'll hand it over to Professor Palmer. Just for everybody's information, we are recording this first part of the presentation for other people that would like to attend to it later. So with that, I'll hand over to Professor Palmer. Thank you so much for your participation.
Okay, good day, good morning, good noon, good evening for those of you who are in this part of the world. And thank you very much, Anna, and to the Spiritual Capital and Moral Leadership Institute for giving me this chance to share a few perspectives coming from East Asia in the Chinese world about the issue of spiritual capital. So I'm going to share screen. Oh, I need to be able to share screen. Could somebody please enable that?
Alain, will you co-host? Right, you should be able to do that now, David.
Okay, right. I'm going to be giving this presentation on spiritual capital in Taoism, Buddhism, and Confucianism, a sociological perspective on capacity building. Now, like many of you in this group, I think many of you in this group have been very deeply involved in conversations and research and applications in different disciplines and different fields of professional endeavor around the conception of spiritual capital. And in the course of my own work and research and social engagement, I've also been involved with some of these conceptions of spiritual capital. And what I'm sure that all of us would let me see here. One of our experiences with this notion of spiritual capital is the difficulty of coming up with a commonly understood definition of spiritual capital. It's a very vague notion. And so both the term spiritual is very vague and is understood differently by different people. And the notion of capital is also very vague as well. But of course, this has its benefits because these are terms that, precisely because of their vagueness, they allow for different people of different backgrounds, different disciplines, different fields of endeavor to come together and to find some connections between different ideas and practices and beliefs. And so there's something to be said about the benefits of vague understandings of spiritual capital, or of really avoiding trying to come up with a very precise definition. And so I think that's a good thing. But at the same time, when we have vagueness, that also gives us the opportunity to look at different ways of considering the question with a little bit more precision. And so that's what I'm going to do today. And I'm going to be looking at the concept of capital using the work of one of the leading sociological theorists of all time, Pierre Bourdieu. on the one hand. So I'm going to just kind of specify what is one understanding of capital through the work of Bourdieu. And I'm going to use three religious traditions in China to come to an understanding or look at three different specific understandings of spiritual. And so that way, by looking at the interrelations with a few more specifically defined conceptions of capital and spiritual, we might come up with some new insights or fresh insights that could help the overall conversation on spiritual capital. So actually, if those of us here who are from Hong Kong, of course, have been following in the past few days the news of a big birthday party that was held just 3 days ago, and which is one of the main spreader events for Omicron version of the virus, which had actually been held out of Hong Kong until this week. And so this was a birthday party where actually a number, it was held by a business tycoon who's also a politician in Hong Kong, and it was attended by a significant number of government ministers, business people, and politicians. So a certain fringe of Hong Kong's elite was at this party, and because it became a spreader event for Omicron, all of them have now been quarantined in the Spartan Penny Bay quarantine center on Lantau Island, or many of them, about 100 of ministers and business tycoons and politicians are all now confined. Actually, this event is a very good illustration of Pierre Bourdieu's theory of capital. So Pierre Bourdieu saw capital as something that's not only economic, but also that's something that can be social and cultural. So he talked about three different types of capital, and in fact, we could talk about more: economic capital, social capital, and cultural capital. So economic capital being just having money, monetary capital, social capital being social networks, and cultural capital being accumulated knowledge of cultural, of different cultural abilities. And so, for example, at this party, it was thrown by somebody who had a lot of money, and so he invited hundreds of guests. By doing that, he was trying to convert his money into social networks, particularly political social networks. And many people were eager to go to this party in order to expand their own social capital. And so basically, this is a party of people who are exchanging, they're exchanging economic capital for social capital, exchanging social capital for economic capital. So it's a setting for the conversion of different types of capital into each other. And this kind of conversion also requires cultural abilities. So that, for example, many of the people who had come to this party, they actually just popped in for 15 minutes just to say hi, to 打招呼. And of course, in order to effectively just pop into a party and speak to the right people at the right time in the right way, in order to maximize the social networking, you have to have some very good cultural skills. If I were to do that and not really knowing how this party culture works in Hong Kong, I might just be standing in the corner and not really getting anything. So cultural capital is also a big part of this kind of game of conversions between different types of capital. And so all of this, this game of capital accumulation and conversion takes place in different social fields. And in these social fields, there are different rules of the game, different ways in which the rules by which you play a certain game to acquire new social connections, to acquire certain cultural abilities, to acquire certain types of knowledge, and so on. And these are unwritten, and the more one absorbs them and the more one internalizes them, they become part of what Bourdieu calls the habitus, these unconscious and embodied dispositions that lead you to be able to play the game without even thinking about it. So again, speaking about the unwritten rules of how to make connections at this birthday party. Well, as a newcomer, let's say somebody from a different culture, not knowing those games, one could tell me, do this, do that, and this and that, and I would be very clumsy. But after doing it many, many times, you internalize it, you know how it is, and then you can do it with virtuosity. You have habitus, you have the unconscious embodied dispositions that come with this kind of capital. So this is basically, in a nutshell, Bourdieu's theory of capital. Now, when we come to a discussion of where does spiritual capital fit into this, I'm going to kind of turn Bourdieu, I'm going to go against Bourdieu in a certain way by underlining what I would call Bourdieu's paradox. So for Bourdieu, as in the way that I described his theory, everything is instrumental. Everything is an instrumental game in which we're all in a competitive game of accumulation or struggle for economic, cultural, or social power. And whatever we do in any of these fields, whether it's economic, social, or cultural, it's only for the purpose of converting it into other types of capital so that we can acquire more power within a certain social field. And so it seems that for Bourdieu, there's really no way out of that kind of really cynical, instrumental game of power. And for Bourdieu, when he does talk about things like religion or spirituality or other types of moral discourses, for him, these are all practices that he would call an illusio. They're actually, they're ways to trick people into believing that they're doing good things, but even when they're doing good things, they're actually just once again playing that game of cultural, symbolic, social, and economic capital. So there's really no way out of it for Bourdieu. But interestingly, Bourdieu himself had a deep sense of mission. He wanted to liberate people from this oppressive game, but it seemed that for him, the only way you could play this game was, you could liberate people from this game, was to critique the game. So in other words, make people aware of this game by analyzing this game sociologically, unmasking this game. Then you know the game. And somehow, I guess, for Bourdieu, that's a moment of sociological enlightenment. And then what can you do is be a sociologist and teach other people how to unmask that game. Now, having also been involved in social action and social activism in the past, it seemed to me that this is actually a profoundly disempowering theory. It allows you to understand, in a sense, many of the oppressive structures of society, and in many ways, it can trigger one's anger or indignation at how the all-pervasiveness of this game, but it doesn't really, it kind of teaches you that no matter what you do, you're always going to be in that game. You'll never get out of it. And so at the end of the day, it's a profoundly, I consider it to be a profoundly disempowering type of exercise. And so this is the paradox of Bourdieu. And so is simply being aware of suffering and oppression a form of liberation? Or should we act differently? Should we try to act in a way that doesn't reproduce that game? Is it possible to change the rules of the game, or is it possible to play a different game? And I think this is the question that spiritual and religious principles force us to ask. Now, seen from this framework, spirituality and religion, we could say, are forms of consciousness of oppression and suffering. And in that sense, they're comparable to Bourdieu's sociology. They use very different discourses and ontologies, but ultimately they aim to make us aware and conscious of how of the roots of suffering and oppression in the world. And they have very different theories about that. But going beyond the awareness and consciousness, religious traditions aim to translate that consciousness into modes of action. So modes of action that are not governed by those same rules of oppression, and that are governed by non-instrumental values, which become embodied dispositions and capacities. So if we were to use, for example, the example of Buddhism, so we have the consciousness of the truth of suffering, for example, that suffering is caused by our cravings and our desires within an impermanent universe. And so this consciousness should translate into a mode of action that is no longer governed by craving and desire, and that this mode of action gradually becomes, through a process of spiritual training or spiritual cultivation, it gradually becomes embodied within within the depths of one's being. Now, having said that, one could say that the Bourdieusian response is that this is precisely a form of illusio. It's an illusion because actually we can see that these non-instrumental values are ideals that are almost never seen in practice, even by those who profess them. So that religious institutions that propagate these values are themselves, again, places where you can accumulate economic capital, where you can make social networks, where you accumulate cultural capital. And scandals about, corrupt Buddhist monks or corrupt churches and so on are certainly illustrations, and not even corrupt ones, but even the day-to-day functioning of any religious institution would be an illustration of how these principles of instrumental social, cultural, and economic capital operate. But I would still nonetheless, in response to that, the Bourdieusian sociological response to this, I would, first of all, on a general principle, make one objection that, for example, one could also say that given that human beings have a very, very hard time converting to renewable forms of energy, and that they're always using non-renewable forms of energy, that means it is impossible for them to change the kind of energy that they use. So what the majority of people's behavior seems to demonstrate is not proof that human beings are unable to act in a different way. So this is where we find the disempowering nature of many sociological theories, which look at how people tend to behave most of the time, and because they behave in a certain way most of the time, therefore they can never change, and society can never change at all. So here's where I would define spiritual capital in a way that's, in a sense, going against the typical Bourdieusian framework. And so here it's looking really actually latching on to the ideal nature of spiritual principles. It's the ideal nature of these values that actually leads us to call them spiritual. So precisely because they are not fully embodied in the material world, they are spiritual. But that spiritual nature, that ideal nature, creates a tension between the value and the lived material world. And this ideal value motivates many people to change their behavior. Maybe it doesn't motivate all people to change their behavior. Maybe it doesn't motivate people to change their behavior to be in perfect alignment with those values. And yet, nonetheless, the ideal value does motivate many people to change their behavior. And to the extent that this occurs, those values then have the power to change people. And to the extent that people cultivate this power, working to transform their lives in a habitual way, they accumulate and embody this ability. This ability becomes part of their habitus. It becomes an embodied wisdom or capital. So then what if we use Bourdieu's structure, in a sense, to add spiritual capital to Bourdieu's typology? So then the first thing we have to think about is, what is the spiritual value or ideal? So if we have economic capital, well, there's a value there. There's economic value. If we're talking about social capital, we're talking about a certain social value. Cultural capital, there are cultural values there. So the first question then is, what is the what is or what are the spiritual values or ideals? What are we aspiring to attain? Now then, once we have a certain set of spiritual values, then there's a spiritual field. In other words, that means a space that we need to navigate, within which there are various different types of forces in order that we may come closer to the spiritual values. And when I talk about the specific examples of Buddhism, Daoism, Confucianism, I'll talk a little bit more of what I mean here. And then so navigating these different forces in order to come closer to those spiritual values, we tend then to need to develop or to train certain embodied virtues, habits, and dispositions. And so this is the spiritual habitus. Now, as one develops and accumulates an embodied habitus, then one accumulates a certain type of, over time, this effort accumulates a certain type of wisdom, wealth, or legacy. So what is that? And so then we'll come to, again, the question of convertibility. How does this spiritual capital relate to economic, social, and cultural capital? Is there convertibility? And so my argument is that yes, but it's a very difficult type of convertibility, or it's a convertibility which has tension built into it to a way that is quite different from the type of convertibility that could exist between instrumental forms of economic, spiritual, and economic, social, and cultural capital. So to briefly look at the three examples of Confucianism, Daoism, and Buddhism. Now, I should just say before I begin is that I'm going to be making sweeping generalizations about these three traditions. And of course, within any of these traditions, one could find so many other ways of thinking, so many other ways of doing. And my purpose here is actually not to come up with some kind of essential characterization of what Buddhism, Daoism, and Confucianism are, but actually simply to illustrate how we can play around with different conceptions and practices of spiritual capital. And one could also add other religious traditions as well. So then, to begin with the case of Confucianism. So what's the spiritual ideal here in Confucianism? And in the Confucian tradition, we could say that perhaps the spiritual ideal is to embody the quality of a gentleman, a junzi, a man of noble character, who embodies a set of virtues and who is able to express these virtues in the way that he relates with other people in social life, and in the way in which he can contribute to the building of harmonious social relationships. So this is the spiritual ideal. And so how does this ideal find its expression? In what kind of field is this, does one try to express this ideal? Well, actually in Confucianism, it's very much a social field. So the Confucian, the person who is on a quest, one could say, to become a gentleman, a junzi, is trying to develop those qualities within a social field that consists of all kinds of different people who have different levels of moral character. And so some of them are gentlemen and others are petty men, 小人. And they're also in the mind of the adept who wishes to become a gentleman. There's also the moral exemplars of Confucius himself and other Confucian exemplars throughout history. So this is the field within which the adept is trying to evolve, dealing with petty people, dealing with exemplary people, trying to come closer or to be more like exemplary people. So this is the field within which one is operating. And so through working in this field, exercising oneself in this field, then one gradually would attain this virtuosity, a way of acting as an inner sage and outer king who has this natural mastery of benevolent virtues and the proper forms of contextualized social etiquette, hierarchy, and ritual. So somebody who's able to handle with mastery complex social relationships in a harmonious and harmonizing way, and in a way which is a demonstration of virtue. And so by doing this, by accumulating this ability for a long time, one would acquire a certain wisdom, a certain reputation, a certain moral authority that could be a good and beneficent influence on other people and on society. So now to look at the example of Taoism. So here the ideal in Taoism, we might say, is to become a zhenren, to become what could be translated as an authentic person. So somebody who has really kind of let go of all these socially inscribed statuses and distortions onto one's true character. And so by letting go of all of these distortions to our character, to become totally at one with the Tao. So here is the spiritual ideal. And so this ideal is to be cultivated into a spiritual field which extends beyond the field of Confucianism, which is more of a social field. And here it's actually a field more of energies in the cosmos, emanating from all the different tendencies, the different qualities and processes of all different beings that exist around oneself: human beings, non-human beings, beings in the environment, the overall disposition of the ecology, the cosmos, and so on. So the Taoist adept, in trying to become an authentic person, is operating and cultivating within that type of spiritual field, and in doing so, gradually acquiring or developing spiritual habitus, which here would be seen as a natural spontaneity and capacity to flow in all circumstances, to be free of all anxieties and constraints, and to influence outcomes without interfering. So here too, the accumulation of these capacities then builds up this spiritual capital, which is also a Taoist wisdom and a capacity to guide and also to heal others. So then to finally look at the example of Buddhism. So here the ideal, the spiritual ideal, would be the quality of an enlightened being, a bodhisattva. So an enlightened being in Chinese Buddhism, a bodhisattva, so who has the motivation and mission to bring enlightenment and salvation to all other sentient beings. And so here I would understand the spiritual field as being the world itself, the world being a world that arouses our desires and passions. As we come into contact with different things in the world, we come to desire them. Our passions arise, and so then these create situations where we need to overcome, where we need to become detached from these desires and passions. So this is the spiritual field within the pursuit of the bodhisattva ideal is carried out. And again, this then through practice then develops a habitus, which is a certain embodied equanimity, mindfulness, and compassion. In the Buddhist, in the Chinese Buddhist worldview, this actually can be understood in a way that's very equivalent to capital, which is the notion of karma. So you accumulate good karma, as well as accumulating, again, wisdom and the capacity to bring others to enlightenment. So through these three examples, I've looked at different types of spiritual ideals and the different types of the different fields within which those ideals are pursued. Now, in real life, somebody who is engaged in a pursuit of those spiritual values faces the problem that the fields within which those values are pursued overlap with the fields in which the instrumental values of economic, social, and cultural capital are pursued. And so how do we deal with this tension between those spiritual values that are often, that go against the instrumental values that we have in the secular forms of capital? So of course, we could say that there are three different options. One is to commit oneself exclusively to the spiritual field and to stay away from the social, cultural, and economic fields. And so to become a hermit, for example, or to become a monk, so to remove oneself from the secular world. But as sociologists would show, this is impossible, because even if one were to remove oneself from the secular world to enter a purely religious institution, that institution itself has its forms of cultural and social capital and so on. So there's no way of avoiding the tensions and contradictions between spiritual capital and the other forms of capital. One could also compartmentalize, pursue economic and social capital on weekdays and pursue spiritual capital on Sundays. Or one could embrace the tension. And so what I want to really explore in the final minutes of this presentation is to explore the implications of embracing the tension, because I think that most of us here involved in the spiritual capital, these discourses on spiritual capital, are really interested in looking at how could one apply spiritual capital in business, in social work, in social activism, in different spheres of life, which are not compartmentalized or separated from the spheres of in which instrumental goals play an important role. And so here it's interesting to look at how in the different traditions this tension can be embraced. And so, for example, the Confucian approach is one where actually perhaps the tension is the lowest between spiritual capital and secular forms of social, cultural, and economic capital. So basically the whole point of Confucianism is to be as adepts at good social relations. And so one would certainly not try to avoid social relations. A good Confucian should go into society, should build good social relations. And to do that should definitely acquire high and refined culture. And during this process, engage in business ventures and so on is certainly something that is highly praiseworthy. And so, but the Confucian should do this in a way that is imbued with virtue and moral principle. And the understanding there is that by embodying these virtues and moral principles, the social relations will actually be stronger and of higher quality. One will be better able to manage different social relations. So actually the social capital will increase even more. And so then it would be natural to be more prosperous in business and so on and so forth. So we could say that the Confucian approach actually, it seems to me, has some tension because one needs to pursue social and cultural and economic capital within a strong moral framework, and yet one must definitely go into the world in which social, cultural, and economic capital are pursued, and one must pursue those things. Now, in Buddhism and Daoism, of course, the traditional kind of orthodox view is one where one should step out. One should chujia, one should enter the monastic life or even become a hermit. However, that's not, lay forms of Daoism and Buddhism are very, very common. And so how to live a Taoist spirituality within this world, within the instrumental world, is something that is also the topic of many, many reflections and different forms of practice. And so perhaps one could say that for someone taking a Buddhist approach to spirituality, then one would want to be detached from these types of capital, but without actually separating oneself physically from them. One would want to cultivate compassion. And an interesting thing in the Chinese Buddhist worldview is that there's actually a very strong notion of circulation between different types of capital through the notion of karma. So that if one is generating good karmic fruit by practicing compassion, by following Buddhist ethical precepts, then there will be many good things will happen. And these good things could very well be good things that occur in the social realm in terms of relationships. Good and productive relationships could arise. Various types of abilities, economic problems might be solved. So one may have good karmic fruit might arise out of following the Buddhist path. Now then these material fruit can be reconverted into spiritual capital. So by spending money to donate to good Buddhist causes or to the promotion of compassion, spending money to the promotion of the spiritual karma. So in that way, very explicitly using material benefits or even social relationships to promote spiritual values is something that is kind of mainstream within Chinese Buddhism. So there's a very strong sense of convertibility. And then now, perhaps in the Taoist approach, the idea should be one of indifference to capital. So one shouldn't be grasping after money or social relations or culture. One should be happy to be living in simplicity and obscurity, even while being surrounded by all these people. And yet, one should embrace change, and one should do without doing, which means one should kind of like a surfer, surf along the different currents. And that means that things could come, all kinds of things might be coming, including money, including relationships, including different types of abilities. So one should channel money, one should channel all kinds of things without seeking them. So I've just talked about three different traditions. And in a sense, I've kind of presented certain contrasts between the three. But when we look at things, having experienced Chinese culture, well, all these different things are never really rigidly separated. And we have elements of Confucian and Buddhist and Taoist culture, in China. And these traditions have been combined over the centuries. And so, on the one hand, one could, as a scholar, one can really separate and compare and look at how they are different, or how they might be similar here and different there, and so on and so forth. But if we consider spiritual capital with this dimension of habitus, at some level, these questions are no longer relevant. Because the habitus is something embodied. So one could embody certain elements that come from Buddhism, certain elements that come from Taoism, other elements that come from Confucianism in one's culture. And at the point once they are embodied, they are no longer subject to discursive issues of contradiction or compatibility, incompatibility. They just become the way one is. And so I think this is a really interesting insight when we're thinking about spiritual capital, because I've just compared three different understandings of spiritual capital. They're different, and yet they're not necessarily contradictory. They come from three distinct traditions, and yet, they're combined in different ways. And so this gives us some insights, and you could lay out all kinds of different traditions, not just the Chinese traditions, and then consider, well, what is an Islamic understanding of spiritual capital? What is a Christian understanding of spiritual capital? And of course, all these religions would have many different understandings of spiritual capital. They can be laid out in distinct ways to come to better conceptual understandings. But then at the end of the day, many of them can also just come together through an embodied, through an embodied spirituality. So finally, I think the main distinction between the classical forms of capital, as they are conceptualized by Bourdieu in terms of social, economic, and cultural capital, and spiritual capital, is the motivation that lies at the root of what is being pursued. So those three types of capital, the three classical types of capital, are really the fruit of instrumental pursuits in the way that they're defined by Bourdieu. On the other hand, the spiritual ideals, they are non-instrumental values. And so at that level, there's a fundamental contradiction, or the fundamental tension between the spiritual values and these other instrumental values. And so this is what we have to really look at here. Now, there is convertibility between the two, however, but the convertibility is not so simple as a conversion between the spiritual, between the social, cultural, and economic. Instrumental motives in and of themselves do not yield spiritual fruit, but spiritual motives may or may not yield instrumental fruit. So this is actually the question, or the kind of the thought that I would like to leave you all with as we open for discussion. So thank you very much.